All right, let's get started. Uh, make sure. Perfect. All right. So, for clarity of what today is going to be, we are walking through the purchase and sale agreement. So, this is more of like a contract theory class. We're going to go through best practices for each section, things that I'm seeing right now that are causing issue. We will obviously talk about changes when we get to them, but it's not specifically to talk about the changes today. So I want to make sure everybody understands like what today is going to be. So before I get into it, is there anything specific you want to make sure I cover today?
Um,
Yes, Nancy.
so I just got an offer on the listing of on a condo, and I did not know they changed the assessment, the HOA assessments section.
Okay.
So,
We'll cover that.
yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Yes, sir.
So I just happened to, before I came on with Keller Williams, I went to a Carolina wine
Mhm.
sales meeting.
Mhm.
And they were talking about Lennar, new construction, putting in like new verbiage in their contracts.
Okay.
I don't know, they were making it like seem like a pretty big deal.
Okay.
Where it was gonna be their contract was gonna supersede any buyer's agreement that they had made, and it's gonna only cover 2.5%, and then, so I didn't know if that was.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah, when we get into the concession side, we're probably won't talk too much about commission today, but if we do have time, we'll jump to that for sure. Okay. Anything else? Going once, going twice.
So we can't change that. We can't think of something as we're going through.
You can. Yeah. Actually, yeah, that's probably should take you. Yeah, Kathy, you're on Nancy Patrol. So, all right, all right. So, section one. And now, here's the deal. If you've never, I haven't actually taught a contract class in a while, so I'm excited to get back to doing this on a regular basis. We're still having Butler College come in and teach it. We're just gonna have twice a month. My answer, if you've ever called with a contract question, has always been, "What does the contract say?" Right, and I literally mean that literally, right, because it's normally covered in here. So 9 times out of 10, anytime you have a question, it's probably in the contract. But I'll also tell you that I carry a copy of the contract around with me because I will also probably want to go look at it, but it's not the expectation to memorize it. Also, you do need to be able to explain it in pretty decent detail to your consumer, right? Because the challenge with not doing that, and you try to fly through these, like with any contractual issue, nothing's a problem until it's a problem, right? And the hardest argument to have in any situation is when it starts from the consumer that says, "Well, I didn't know what I was signing because the agent just sent it to me through DocuSign," right? And that's tough because I'm going to protect you and remind the consumer that they are in fact an adult that signed the document that they probably should have read. And we also do have a best practice and a duty to explain to them what the contract is without being an attorney. Right. So there's a couple of different ways to skin that cat. So all right. So the first one is parties, right? Section one is the parties. Who's going to be purchasing on this? In a best case scenario, you'll have a copy of the deed. You know exactly what the deed says for the seller. If you don't have a copy of the deed, go to the tax records. Tax records are not accurate. You're not going to know that. What's another really good way to make sure, if you're looking at this from a buyer's agent standpoint, that you have the correct sellers on the contract? Call the listing agent. Look at that. Already picking up great habits. Call the listing agent. So many things can be helped in negotiations. The buyer and the buyer's agent and the listing agent will have a conversation before. But it is important to have that on there. A couple of things that we are seeing up, and if it isn't an LLC, the DocuSign signature needs to be the name, not the LLC. I've had a couple of those get kicked back where it's like DocuSign automatically populated 123 Main LLC as the actual signature. Nobody saw that. They just clicked sign and go. It actually needs to be the name. If there are multiple people on the deed, they all need to be on the contract for it to be a valid contract. The other thing that shows up from the buyer, yes, sir.
Just regarding LLCs, if it's a multi-party LLC, but only one person is like the signatory, does everybody have to sign or just?
No, whoever's authorized to sign for the LLC.
Good question.
On the buyer side, that comes up all the time is mom and dad are buying the house or giving the money, but daughter's going to be on the deed. Most times I would say go ahead and get clarity from the attorney. Right? But in that situation, if daughter can't or son can't buy the house without mom and dad's money, mom and dad probably need to be on the contract. And then they can deed the house however they want at closing. Right? So a lot of those really intricate, like if you get much more detail than those two right there, I would say go ahead and contact and engage the attorney who's going to be handling the closing. Because they also have to be comfortable with however you've decided or what another attorney has decided. Understand that attorneys interpret, they don't make the law, right? So AJ could have an attorney that says, yes, do it this way. But then the closing attorney says, well, I'm not comfortable with that way. I need you to do it this way, right? So just something to keep in mind in there. Conversation, or excuse me, definitions in this. Parties or anybody that is in there, buyer or seller. Parties described as both buyer and seller. That's it. Those are the only parties to the contract. Agents are not parties to the contract. Agent commission now has the opportunity to be part of the contract. That does not make agents party to the contract. Okay, so brokers are licensed, South Carolina brokers in charge. They're associated real estate licensees. So anytime it says broker signature, you actually, and this kind of the state says it comes down to company policy. Our company policy is anytime it calls for broker signature, you can sign as a designated licensee. Now, where that might get pushed back are in releases or in compensation agreements. Some other brokers or attorneys may want my signature on there. That's fine. Don't die on that hill. Throw it a DocuSign, send it to me. Don't like you've got so much bandwidth when you're negotiating and you're asking for things. Don't waste it on what our policy is versus theirs. It's not worth it. Closing attorney is a South Carolina attorney who is going to be handling the closing here. This is not required for this to be a valid contract. It also does not have to be agreed upon by both parties. The closing attorney is chosen by the buyer. That is who chooses it. Now, and according to the contract, there is no way for a seller to refuse closing with a certain attorney. Now, I guess you could argue that if they say if they're going to use so-and-so attorneys, we don't want to ratify a contract with them. I guess they could agree to not just ratify a contract with them. They can't refuse an attorney once the contract is ratified. I know this is more common practice now, but I always do advise that the sellers have separate representation. Right. Ironically, the first time that we've had same dual representation is happening right now, and we have a fairly decent conflict between the buyer and the seller on something that's supposed to close next week. So now they're both having to go seek counsel from others. So I would have the seller engage a separate attorney. Yes.
So don't do litigation anyway, so don't.
They don't really do litigation, but they can help to a point. But that is a good point to make is if people start saying we're going to sue 9.5 times out of 10, the closing attorney is not going to do anything. Right. Effective date is the final date upon which all negotiations are. So the effective date is the date that the final signature was closed, right? Or initial, I should say, closed. When I say closed, what does that mean? When I say ratify, when I say a signature or initial is closed, what does that mean? Every signature and every initial has to have a matching signature and initial from the other party. By all parties, I should say. That's what I mean by that. Right?
I did a repair addendum, and it's like 50,000 different changes. Do you really need an initial?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's not physically possible.
Then get a new contract.
Yeah,
Because when that contract goes south,
yeah,
they will win.
okay.
We had one,
Box.
it was a high net worth individual who was buying a house on Johns Island. And negotiating back and forth, they agreed on a final price. Buyer sent buyer initial.
Yeah.
Final price, not seller.
Okay.
Buyer initial final price, sent back. Seller did not sign off on the initial.
Yeah.
Maybe wrong on that, doesn't matter. Everyone had agreed.
Right.
Buyer found a house he liked better.
Oh,
Had his attorney review it. Attorney said, you don't have a valid contract.
oh,
By law.
oh.
And they kept their earnest money.
Mm.
Well, the earnest money wasn't there. The court ruled the mediation. We went to mediation. It's $35,000 in earnest money, by the way. It's a lot of money that we had to pay. Because that was our agent's responsibility. Then we represented the seller. It was our agent's responsibility to make sure that initial got closed. Right. So again,
you guys ate that?
it was split among us, the agent, and of course the agent wasn't with us anymore. Not like dead, but
Like you murdered them.
Yeah,
It was that bad, you killed them.
Yeah, swimming with the rose, by the way. This thing is like, this is it, I'm out here. And it was a good agent, like, I have a lot of respect for the agent. She's never, and they were following up, like, hey, we need your initial, we need your initial, we need your initial, and they just never did. And it was just because you had, I mean, the buyer was a NBA player. It was like, there were so many people communicating. I don't even think they were purposely trying to not initial for any reason. There was just a lot of people involved in the communication. So it's interesting. Good funds, the transfer required amount of US dollars, the time, all stated, shall be South Carolina local time. Time is of the essence, respect for all provisions of the contract, meaning that if a time frame is in there, any time frame is. Okay, so you have to follow it, and it does. If you do not follow it, it can make it avoidable contract. All right, last part of section 1. Buyer and seller are licensed real estate. This one I've actually kind of seen quite a bit come across my desk because we're not checking these off right here, but we're having people initial them. Right, so you want to make sure that you are actually checking off whether or not they're receiving client or customer service, and that they've agreed to that. So pretty important on that one. We have seen actually some against there was a court case that you had to be an expert witness in. It's kind of fun. But one of the arguments against the agent that was being sued was that they had their buyer initial here, but nothing was selected. And so the claims attorney's argument was, what kind of fiduciary responsibility doesn't even check off whether or not they represent? So they're just, all the little things can add up. And the purpose of this is not to scare you, but the purpose is kind of to scare you, right? It's like, do everything that you can to protect your client, right? To protect your client in this. Yes.
I've seen it where like I'll receive one
Mhm.
as I represent the seller. And the buyer agent will have already checked off the box for the seller for me as a client. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, is that fine? I mean, and I know that that's the case, but I thought it was presumptuous.
I think they're just trying to help.
Well,
Yeah, I think that's more of a, yeah.
I mean, you're assuming that you take a listing.
In that case, if it's in the MLS, they'd have to be representing, because the MLS requires representation.
Okay, then that's why.
But I think that's more of a, the challenge could be on the other way around, but I think that's probably more expedited, but again, keep in mind, is that really the case?
Right.
Like, if it were the case in a for sale by owner situation, right, and you were truly doing, your neighbor says, hey, help me facilitate this contract, you're not gonna represent me, I'm gonna pay you the transaction broker,
Right.
and in that case, it would not be.
So the I say realty, like the Randall Longo, whatever, is that
Yeah, it's an actual, they represent.
okay as a client?
Client.
Interesting. Okay.
Purchase price is what it is, payable good funds. Now, things here that can be made mistakes. Again, nothing but problem. It's a problem. You're either financing, a combination financing in cash or cash. 99% of the time, it is going to be the middle one, right? They're not getting 100% financing, right? They may be paying 100% cash. Okay, great, that was easy. But 9 times out of 10, it's going to be, I'm giving a loan and I'm bringing cash. This next part is very important. Verification of cash available for closing is or is not attached to be delivered or to be delivered by blank. That's super important if it's an all cash deal. It's also super important if you've got somebody who's claiming that their financing is going to be a 50% financing. Right? You want to make sure that they have that cash.
If you have a mortgage, I mean, you'll have a mortgage pre-approval or whatever. Will the mortgage person, see, to me in my mind, the mortgage person only gets a $500,000 house, they're getting $250,000 mortgage, and they approve it for 500, that you should still give it.
I still would, and that, again, all of this is explaining what the options are and what the seller's most comfortable. In that case, I'd still want proof of funds because I don't know if the lender has asked for it yet.
Right,
And again, the whole purpose of this is not to win,
right.
right? The whole purpose is this to get to closing.
Well, as a listing agent, you want to know.
Yeah, 100%.
So I leave that as like I don't check anything there, but then I just submit like the proof of funds anyway. I just do
As a
that.
buyer's agent?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Cause I mean, honestly, where that, I don't know, vagary is a good tactic, but it's not a bad, right? It's like, I don't know that I'd keep it vague for that, but it does protect your client more, because if you provide a proof of funds, but for whatever reason, they wanted a different type or anything like that, they can't now come back and say, well,
That's it.
formal contract.
Yep.
Like, I get that. Like, I think that's, and then the last part, contract is or is not contingent on the buyer's sale of property. There's 2 parts of this, it either is or is not. If it is, I don't know why as a seller you would ever accept the offer without Form 504 attached. as the buyer's agent, I could see it, right? As a buyer's agent, and the buyer, like, sure, it's contingent on my own selling, but I don't want any limitations here. If it's not attached, and some people will submit it that way. If it's not attached, I counter with attachment.
Got it.
That's probably an area I would, obviously the seller still has the optionality, but I would be pretty, adamant on this one. Say, Mr. Seller, where I appreciate you're okay with it, just understand, they can be under contract until the day of closing without Form 504 and saying my house didn't close and then they're out, and you're off the market now for however long. You're not seeing a lot of sellers push back on that. Where you're seeing buyers push back is they've already got a contract on the house that's supposed to close next week. And it's like, hey, well, we don't need the form. I would still do it. Just tighten the form up.
Oh, there's another form. There's two forms. One is for sale and settlement, and one's basically settlement. They don't say it that way in their forms, but there's one, because I just did it. But their house is
Yeah,
already
because-
agreement, and that's just like a one-page testament.
Right.
You're talking about 505.
505 is the release of it. I'll look that up. When we're done. Don't look it up now. I'll look it up though. All right. Paragraph 3, section 3 says a lot. Section 3 has a lot of information. It's very interesting because section 3, we think is talking just about the property and all we really focus on are the blanks. Obviously, best case scenario, you have a deed, you can fill out every single bit of it. If you don't have that, the property and tax records to me are the most important things that are all, or tax number that you're gonna have on there. All the information you can have, great. If you don't have the information, I would put in A. I don't like blanks in contracts. Right.
You would use what?
I would put in A
Oh,
or a dash
okay.
or something along those lines. All right, but let's talk about the paragraph itself. Acknowledging sufficient contract consideration. Basically, we have a contract. Seller will sell and convey, the buyer will buy the purchase price, any and all of the lot of parcel of land, pertinent interest, improvements, landscape systems, and fixtures, if any thereon or featured described below, property. We're gonna come back to that. Actually, yeah, we're gonna come back to that. Seller agrees to maintain, this is a big one. This is a big one. This is a big one. The one you probably want to explain to your seller at the listing consultation. Seller agrees to maintain in operable condition the property and any personal property conveying in same operable condition, including any landscaping grounds and any agreed upon areas of repairs or replacements from the effective date through closing, subject to normal operation wear and tear. All right, we're going to stop there first. A couple reasons, a couple things about this first section. Number one is personal property. So you do have the ability below to put in the personal property. That no personal property will transfer except for what's described below or the attachment. I would use the personal property addendum. Okay, couple of things on this that I would not do. As seen in the MLS. Don't put as seen in the MLS. MLS is an advertisement. You might as well put as seen on TV. That's all it is. Like it's not. And then what happens in the MLS, right? We had an occasion one time where the pictures were done on the property. This actually happened. Pictures were done for the property to go to market. And after the photos were done, the seller changed out the light fixtures before they went live. Right, so they had told us early on, it was just something that was missed. Right, so before it went live, they changed it out. So buyer buys a house, falls in love with the house, blah, blah, blah. Then the buyer gets the appraisal back and sees in the pictures of the appraisal, it's different than the pictures in the MLS. But we had nothing in here. And even if we had, we said didn't see in the MLS, like then there's a conflict that's there. So you have to be careful on like how specific you are on this and the time frame. For personal property, the personal property addendum, the problems that show up are as seen in the MLS or as seen when when the property was shown on April 1st, blah, blah. There's so much interpretation that can happen there. Right? Like buyers can say, well, that refrigerator was here, and the seller will say, no, I'd already moved it out. And then 9 times out of 10, they're both wrong. Right? So just put it in there. The personal property addendum doesn't specify as much as it should, but it does say current appliances in the property, still kind of vague. So if you really like, if you've got a high net worth or a high, price item that you want in there, just write it out.
And Joseph, that really used to refer to when there wasn't a personal property addendum. That's
Right.
new. It
Right.
used to be referred to the bill. But
Right, well, the
like
bill of
somebody
sale,
bought a refrigerator in the water.
That's the one that's not in there.
Bill of sale.
yeah, the personal property addendum though does still, I think, say to refer to bill of sale. if there's a- The other part of this is if you are conveying anything that's personal property, you need to make sure you understand what current condition of said personal property is. Right? Refrigerator that's in the house, ice maker didn't work. Seller knew that, hadn't worked for years, like every single friggin' ice maker ever. Right? It's like it just didn't work. So then final walkthrough comes along, they go through for whatever reason, try the ice maker's not working. Now you've got this battle saying you were supposed to maintain the property the way that it was. Seller says I worked, I did. Buyer says, no, this worked at closing. You have no proof that it did it. It was not on the inspection or anything along those lines. Tough situation, but somebody bought the fridge. So making sure you're clarifying ahead of time what's in there. So mad. I was on a boat when I had to buy a fridge too. I knew exactly where I was. I was coming into Seabrook. Man, I was mad.
So even the personal property said, it denim says like everything up top conveys except, and that's when you write the stuff that doesn't convey.
Yeah.
Where in any of this would you put refrigerator, washer, dryer?
You would put it here or on the personal property.
Okay, so you could put here.
Gotcha. All right. Next part. This one's always interesting and kind of a moot point, seeing as though you have due diligence. Because you really can get out of due diligence for any reason or no reason at all. But this is basically saying the buyer acknowledges the opportunity to inquire about owner association issues, lease common area issues, condominium master deed issues, assignment parking spacious storage, lease issues, all those finance equipment, leasing issues and items finance equipment adjustments, tenant leases, all this. Basically, it says you're buying all of it, but you need to do the research ahead of time. Again, this is not as big of a deal now because we have due diligence. However, if something comes up after due diligence, and one person, what's happened right now, and I think we recently had this, I think you might have had this recently with T, is they're saying, well, this was a material fact I should have known. And so I was like, well, I didn't know. So we should have known your research. Like I did it. You actually were told to do the research before you even bought the house. So again, it's one of those where I think the lesson to take from this is during due diligence, if you have questions about HOA, just get everything done on that. And by the way, as the buyer's agent, don't be the only messenger, be the conduit, be the one that says, Jan, you have questions about the association, please meet AJ, the president or the person, the property manager, whoever it is of the association.
Yeah.
Here are the connections. Be part of the conversation. Don't be the filter of the conversation. Because what happens is you say to me, that goes to Jan, you were wrong, and then it's me. And it's like, well, wait. If they've just been involved, then it was them. Right? So be careful how you position yourself.
Joseph, we just had one last week that, the seller said there was no HOA. This was in Windsor Hill. And they got to the closing table and the attorney for the buyer said, turned to my agent who was representing the buyer and said, there's no HOA in Windsor Hill. He goes, oh, yes, there is. He said, what do you mean? He said, the attorney for the seller said there isn't one. Because our agents are pretty good. He said, yes, there is. This is who the contact is, and this is what it's there for.
Yeah.
We did not close.
So that one. And I think in that specific case, I mean, that's a material fact that should have been disclosed.
I was gonna say, where does because I'm running into this right now with these buyers. That should be disclosed, no problem, no ifs, ands, or buts on the seller property disclosure.
Right.
So if that is incorrect, like I'm going through a nightmare right now with this other agent, I'm like, what is it or is it not? Did you or did you not
Right.
have problems, or did your seller?
Yeah.
Well, you check, I'm telling problems with the plumbing, electrical, and then there's no explanation. You're not doing your job as an agent, following up with your client saying, hey,
Yeah, well,
Not-
let's come back to that.
well, that's a good topic.
No, that's a good point on there. I think at the end of the day, and again, there's always gonna be exceptions. Like that's an extreme case there. Like that's a hard one. Because did the seller know and the seller lied? I don't know. Seller's attorney communicates something's incorrect. They added one and somehow the seller didn't know. Really happens more in assessments, or contribution fees, which we'll get to.
We did finally get it closed.
Yeah.
But it was 5 days later. So it was over Easter.
Yeah.
whole ball of wax.
Yeah.
And thankfully, my agent knew his stuff.
Yep.
He said, we're not closing until you're out of the HOA piece.
Yeah. Which is fair. All right, page 2, section 4, conveyance closing possession. Closing occurs when the seller conveys the property and occurs no later than 5 p.m. on or before closing date. Here, fun fact. Buyer says, I want to close at 10 a.m. The seller's not out by 10 a.m. Are the sellers in breach?
No.
No. Seller owns the property until 5 p.m. So just because the buyer should have the closing at 10 does not mean the seller's in breach. It's happening all the time. All the time. They're not out. They're in breach. They're not in breach. They got till 5. They got till 5. Now, there's a logistical issue of can you close at 5? No. Should you be advising your sellers to move out at 9:45 a.m. if the closing's at 10? No. Right? This is part of your duty as a seller, as a listing agent. Hey, we've got a closing date of April 30th. My suggestion to you is to be able to move out on April 25th. Right? There's no need to wait till the last minute here, people. We're talking about 5 days worth of prorated rent that is worth it with whatever heartburn you're preventing. Okay? So just something to keep in mind on there. It's also why I don't love early closings. Right? Just don't do an early close. Give it some time. Things are going to come up. They're going to come up. They're going to come up. Conveyance shall be fee simple, made subject to all easements, reservations, rights of way, restrictive covenants, records, provided that they do not make the title unmarketable. This is a big one that's we've seen this quite a bit, actually. You see this with heirs properties, you see this with liens, mechanic liens, yada, yada, yada. Understand, I'm not an attorney, but understand that if something comes up and the house cannot be sold, regardless of whether the seller knew about it, they should have. So marketable title can breach your seller pretty quickly when one of these come up. So if anything's preventing it from being marketable title, what all this is like, you can't come back and say, well, I can get this fixed in 5 days, so that's fine. I didn't know. That's great. The buyer's expecting to close on April 30th at 5. You can't. You could be a breach. So just want to keep that in mind. Seller agrees to convey marketable title with the property recorded general warranty deed free of encumbrances and in the names of blank. This is the ownership type and the names that you put on here. This is not required for the contract. This could be though, where if you're putting in a situation where mom and dad are buying a house and they can put kids' names here, or vice versa, you can put like whatever you name. If you did want to put it in an LLC, you can put it in here. It's ultimately going to come down to how the attorney wants you to deed it in, or let you deed it anyway. All right, the deed shall be delivered to closing attorney's designated place on or before closing date no later than 10 a.m. This is one that people, here's the deal. If you do have your seller being represented by a different attorney, make sure that this attorney has a copy of the contract and knows that all that seller paperwork, deed work, all that needs to be done and sent to the closing attorney. I would ask to make sure they did it the day before. Because you do have a risk if you don't provide it by 10 a.m. at that point. That is different from saying you're out of the house by 5 p.m. This is actual times of the essence deadline in the contract that says you had to have deed delivered by 10 a.m. Just make sure that's the case. All right, seller agrees to pay deed recording fees. Party agrees the broker shall have access to closing relevant documents. That's more of a disclosure to make sure that everyone understands that the brokers are going to be reading everything. They should give copies of settlement statement, get it ahead of time for review. Parties agree that they have licensed attorneys closing. They have to be licensed in the state of South Carolina. We just had that question recently. Sellers shall convey property, possession of a vacant and reasonably clean property, free of debris, along with all keys, codes, any remote controls, available documents, and similar ownership items to buyer at closing. So, a couple things on this one that show up. It is amazing how much of this stuff shows up. Free of debris, reasonably clean. Let's start there. Reasonably clean is a very subjective definition of clean. Reasonably clean to my wife is very different than reasonably clean to me. Right? So make sure when you're explaining this to your buyer, you say, they can leave this property vacant and reasonably clean. If cleanliness is an issue to you, Let's ask them to clean it. Seller, you are to leave this property reasonably clean. Cleanliness is likely going to be an issue for a buyer. Budget a cleaner. Like, just do that, right? Just have it clean, free of debris. Be out, get out, right? So what does that mean? Can I leave this here? I don't know. So the answer is no, right? Don't leave it open for interpretation. Just make sure you're having that discussion with them. This other, with all keys, codes, and any remote controls.
Closing door, he said, I have no keys, there's a code.
I have no idea what my key to my house is. I have no idea what the key to my house is, right?
How do you have code?
If it's locked.
You know, this is, to me, this is, but I did find that HOAs usually will give you, because you're supposed to get two.
Yeah.
But they will provide one to you
Yeah.
for free if you only get one. And mail key is a pain in the butt.
So here's the deal. Start putting those practices in.
Yeah.
Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, one of the things I'm gonna ask you to do. Let's go ahead and have 2 copies of all your keys made. Let's go ahead and have those made. Go ahead and put them in the very right kitchen drawer. That's where we're gonna leave them when you close on it anyway. It's already there. That's taken care of.
Yeah.
Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, our keys are concerned for you. I don't think they should be. I think one of the things you should budget is to have the whole house rekeyed when you move.
Yeah, that's what I.
Yes, right.
Like here, there's like, you're buying a house, right? Like,
Well,
let's.
how many
Let's
keys
just
have
get
given out to their neighbors?
I think it was the agent, bro. Like, I literally remember it was in Park. No, what's the one that's right by Mellow Mushroom in Mount Pleasant?
Ivy Hall.
Ivy Hall. Ivy Hall. I remember saying in the middle of July, a suit and tie, a ladder, reprogramming a friggin' garage door. The listing agent, I was buyer's agent. My wife was so mad. Listing agent's there. We key in the, and we're sweating our tails off because the buyer and the seller sat there like actual children and like, oh my God, it's the greatest thing ever. Communicated ahead of time. All right, earnest money. Couple things we're seeing on this. There's a total and then when it's delivered. Right? So you have a total amount, which say for this, it's $1,000. It's gonna be paid as follows. Blank accompanies this offer. Unless you are handing them a check while handing them the offer, it ain't accompanying the offer. So my recommendation is that 0 accompanies this offer and 1,000 will be deposited by whatever date. Right? So if it were today, I would say by the end of the day tomorrow. Okay? Should that not happen? Or here's how it can happen. Earnest money, check, cash, never cash, don't ever do cash, never cash. My second closing was cash. I don't know when I came in, it was like $200. When I came in, I handed it to my MCA. Huh? Singles was weird. Yeah. Honestly, with that buyer, it wouldn't have been surprising. He was a little nutto. My MCA looked at me, he was like, what is happening? Literally like put it into an envelope. They'll do cash. Other, you can wire it, credit to the buyer. It's credited to the buyer. Yes.
Let's give you, I once did that and I took a picture of it and I did because you need proof.
Yeah.
But if somebody does give you cash, like you take that cash and then put it in your bank. And
Oh.
That's what I'm saying.
Perhaps straight to the closing attorney, which 9 times out of 10, they won't take it.
Oh,
Especially on a Friday after 5 o'clock.
Right. I mean, I would say in that case.
yeah.
I would say we need to get a cashier's check. So take to a bank,
Take their
yeah,
cash and go to a.
they need to take their.
Yeah.
Like, and again, when you're explaining this to them before they're submitting an offer, by the way, all this is assuming you're explaining this while they're not like on the hood of the car right in the driveway. If they can't,
Yeah.
then get the time. They're buying a house.
Yeah.
Right? So it's one of those where it's like, hey, I understand that you have cash. I'm sorry to communicate this to you sooner. We need a cashier's check.
Okay.
Right?
And have them
Yeah, they have.
Then,
drop it.
correct.
With the escrow.
Yep. All right, it'll be credited to the buyer at closing, dispersed only as parties in writing. Authorizes whoever to hold escrow. We don't hold escrow. There's really very few companies that still hold escrow. Real estate companies, like Carolina One still does.
Yes.
Very few people do. We still have an escrow. We still have $20,000 in our escrow account from before I was in this office because we have, it's unaccounted for funds and it's so annoying. Just look at that.
It's free it up.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's crazy. Like about every 60 days, Tiffany's like, hey, we need to do something about this. I'm like, yeah, we do. All right. All of this paragraph here, I'm not going to read through it. I would here's what I explained to both sides of that. This is very bold and loud to let you know that the buyer is going to provide earnest money, or you're gonna provide earnest money, depending on who you're talking to, right? The earnest money is basically a promise to say, I'm going to perform on the contract. And if I breach the contract, I'm at worst, I could lose it, or you could gain it. What all of this says here is that regardless of how obvious it is of whether or not it was a breach, it will not be dispersed until everyone in the contract agrees. So, Mr. Seller, they could walk away from the closing table because they didn't like the color of the furniture in the closing room. Obvious breach, that's not getting released until everyone signs that. I tell you that because I don't want you to expect that it's just earnest money at stake that you just get should it go to law. I know that sounds like it's a lot, it sounds a little extreme, but what I don't want you to think is that you can just say, oh, if they breach, I get their money. They still have to say, yeah, I breached, here's the money. Or a court has to say, release the money. Okay? So again, you want to overly explain this a little bit, that it's not as black and white as you would think it would. Make sense? Also a good opportunity to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the goal here, and when we're negotiating and writing and interpreting a contract, the goal here is not to win the earnest money. The goal here is to close. Right. So like, don't like, again, let's have some perspective on it. All right, questions about that so far? It's fun stuff, isn't it? It's good stuff.
This is random, not related, but since they made this bottom section bigger, do they want a full signature instead of the initials like we have been doing?
It's a good question. No,
It's funny, you said that, because the last one I did, it auto prompted initials.
Yeah,
it's initials.
it is, okay,
It's initials.
I
It's
just
probably
wondered why they would
given
do-
room for
okay,
multiple clients on either side,
okay, cool.
multiple parties.
Just wanna make sure.
Excellent question. All right, transaction costs. This is where it defines transaction costs. Transaction costs, unless otherwise agreed upon in writing. Buyer will pay buyer's transaction costs and seller will pay seller's transaction costs. Number one, buyer's transaction costs include all of these things. Things from financing, prepaids, recurring items, insurance, but not limited to mortgage insurance, title insurance, flood insurance, hazard insurance, discount points, interest, non-recurring closing costs, title exam, allowable costs, fees and expenses, buyer's attorney, contractually required real estate brokerage compensation, in the amount the compensation buyer owes to the broker, and the cost of any inspection, appraisal, or survey. This is basically just saying any cost the buyer has to buy the house is a buyer's cost. Seller's cost includes deed prep, deed recording fees, all the things on here, stamps. All costs necessary to deliver marketable title. This is a big one. Go back to the example I had before. You find out a week before closing, you've got a lien on your property. Well, I can't close. That's gonna cost me $2,000 to make it free and clear. This right here says you agreed to pay that $2,000 or whatever it costs for you to make it marketable. So again, it's pretty strict on that. Property taxes prorated at closing, contractually require real estate brokerage compensation, the amount of compensation the seller owes their broker, unless fees, expenses, and fees and expenses from their seller's attorney. Then we talk about, in addition to, you have seller or buyer's transaction costs, with the following costs in addition to the costs above will be considered sellers or buyer's transaction costs. This is where you can select who's going to be paying for these. What I love about this is the next sentence. It says if no box is selected, it goes to the seller. I love that because then you don't have this happen so often, because this used to be a tiny little like selection at the end of the paragraph. And people would just forget. And then you have, well, I don't know. And then the attorneys would all say what? Split it. Right. And then everybody's like, well, I never wanted it. It's just terrible. All right. So all costs obtained from the permitting to pertaining to the homeowners association, printing document fees, estoppel fees, private and or public transfer fees, any cost similar to transfer fees, certificate of assessments, capital contributions, estoppel fees, or otherwise. So this is a big one. This is a big one. Because if there are contribution fees and the seller doesn't know about it, we had this stamp right across from Seaside with the lakes.
Hidden like.
Lakes. Yeah, yes, the Hidden Lake. They had one. We had a closing in there, and the two HOA meetings prior to us going under contract, they had voted in a contribution. Sellers had no idea. Sellers lived in there. So they built a house in there. It's in there. $2,500. And in our conversation, they said, well, what are the risks here? And I said, there's not really any risks. And if you don't, you have a contribution fee. They were like, no, we don't. I was like, all right, then, that's fine. Let's not worry about it. That didn't go well with them. So just keep in mind, I know what that is. All right, then section 4 is when you talk about whether or not the seller is going to pay a portion of the buyer's transaction fees. This is where you ask for concessions. All right, so in this case, we're going to ask for $10,000 in concessions. And then options A and options B is whether or not they will allow a certain amount to be paid to the buyer's broker, or it does not allow any of it to go to the buyer's broker. The seller can say no. Seller can say no, I don't want any of this going to the buyer's broker. If you want this money's going to anything other than the buyer's broker. Okay. Now, this part right here, concession cannot go solely to pay the transact compensation broker if the concession was advertised on the MLS for multiple listing survey. Again, if you advertise that you're giving a concession, well, our MLS doesn't allow you to do that. First of all, they can just say whether or not they're negotiable. So it's a kind of a gray area at this point. I would say, I mean, the workaround on this, not workaround. But if it were advertised or you're not sure, it's 10,000 and you want all the go to buyer's agent's fees and it's 9,999 goes in this number there. Right? Typically when you do that, the attorney's still giving the 10,000 to the buyer's side or to the buyer's agent. But again, if it were advertised in there, so for instance, if you do start like with Kelly's example earlier, if you're going to start offering concessions for buy downs or anything like that, that's offering a concession, which then says that not all of that concession can go to their agent. Make sense? All right, question so far. All right, buyer's responsible for any buyer's transaction costs exceeding this amount. If the amount exceeds the actual amount in those costs or amount allowed by the lender, then any excess funds will revert to the seller. How many knew that was in there?
Yes.
It does. We're not seeing it as much now as we used to, but it could, right? And that's a problem. Because if the buyer's paying this amount to get this amount of transaction costs, they can only take this amount of transaction costs. This delta then goes to the seller. The buyer, it's not a great situation for the buyer. So how do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, for me, I just always get those numbers from the lender,
Right. Bring the lender in. Have that conversation with the lender.
any offer.
Yeah. It doesn't happen often, but it happens enough for us to have a regular conversation about it.
Could you just explain that one more time for me?
So let's say we have a house. I'm gonna give an extreme example. The house is priced at 500,000. Buyer comes in and they say, hey, I want to get as much money as possible out of this. So I want you to pay me 20,000 in closing costs. Okay. And then we get close. So basically at this point, the buyer themselves is their net price is honestly what? 480. Right? But let's say we find out that their closing costs are only $15,000. So now we have a delta of $5,000 here that the seller agreed to pay because the buyer wanted it, but the buyer can't receive it because it's basically cash back at closing at that point, or whatever it may be, or their lender won't allow it. That additional 5,000 goes right back into the seller fund. So then this number at closing becomes this number there. So the seller wins by $5,000.
That delta be used to buy points or something? I mean.
Yeah, but you're redoing everything right at closing.
Well, you could, correct. You could, if the lender allowed, which they still might not. So.
Hope you know there was an excess way.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, and it goes back to like Lane's point, like bring the lender in early.
I had a weird situation where like someone's parents were buying the house and like the kids didn't have any money. And so the kids were like, well, they'll pay for everything, but they would have us pay for our own closing costs.
Yeah.
And then we had to contact Butler and College, have them run everything as if it was like a cash. It was a long process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not someone.
Yeah.
HOA dues and assessments are not considered transaction costs and are addressed by the closing attorney as needed. A transfer fee is a non-reoccurring fee that is being assessed solely because of a transfer in the property ownership. So two things here. if you've got an HOA that's $12,000 a year and you close on July 1, right? And it was already paid, then obviously the buyer is going to have to pay the second half of the year that they're living in the property. So that's an additional $6,000 they will have on there. They're saying here that's not considered a closing cost because it's actually something that you had for the HOA that you're getting into by purchasing that. Okay. All right, HOA assessments. Again, this is not dues or membership fees. There's two options here. Special assessments approved prior to closing shall be the responsibility of the seller. Special assessments approved after the closing shall be the responsibility of the buyer. Any remainder of the balance due on a special assessment approved prior to closing will be paid in full by the seller at closing. Okay, that's what that option is. Seller's going to say, hey, paying everything in full at this point. Option 2 says seller shall be responsible for a portion of any assessments approved prior to closing that are due in the calendar year of the closing. Any remaining special assessment payments in the subsequent years are the responsibility of the buyer. Parties direct the closing attorney to make the appropriate adjustments in paragraph 21 of this agreement. Special assessments approved by the closing shall not be returned to the buyer. So again, option 1 is saying thing that's happened, this doesn't pertain to anything approved after, no one is pertaining to anything approved after closing. That's kind of that statement. But what option number 1 is saying is, let's just say, you had a year. You're closing here. Option 1 is saying if there was an assessment here, right? The seller is going to pay it all prior to it going. And let's say it was a monthly assessment that was then reoccurring after the fact, right? They're going to pay that remaining off at closing. Make sense? Okay. Option 2 basically says they'll pay everything in full here, and then the buyer is responsible for everything on that assessment. Now, one's going to ask, why would the buyer agree to that? Or why, I think there's a strong, solid argument that if it's an assessment that's ongoing and it hasn't been repaired yet, if I'm the seller, I'm like, why am I paying for something I'm never going to benefit from? Now, if this is an assessment that came in for repairs that were already done and it was an assessment after the fact, okay, I see that, right? The repairs were done, I lived in the property, it was fixed for me to use. But if you're doing an assessment now for repairs that aren't happening until now, I am paying for this. I'm not gonna get any of it. So, questions? All right, I know you'll, okay,
The option 1 should be more for the buyer.
yeah, I mean, option 1 favors the buyer because the seller's covering it all.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, financing, I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly. Financing talks about whether or not they are contingent upon financing, what type of loan they're having. I'll make sure this is filled out, have that in there, what percentage, everything is there. Don't set your buyer up for failure. Big one in here, we get this all the time. In a timely manner, buyer shall inform the seller and brokers of pertinent financial issues and authorize the buyer's lender to disclose pertinent loan information to seller and broker. That's a big one. We get people all the time. Oh my gosh, you get a call all the time. Like, I cannot believe that your lender told, or you told the seller's agent about what's going on in financing. You gave me permission to. It's a material fact of the contract. You just told me you lost your job. Like I need to let them know, right? It does not mean that they can release you from the contract, right? It just means that I have to let you know so they can prepare for it. Because if I don't tell them, you try to fix it, and a week and a half later, we tell you it fell through, and then they find out I knew a week and a half ago, they're not only going to be pissed, right? So that's the big one we need to make sure on there. I shall,
Apply for financing.
yeah, they apply for financing by a certain date. That's super fun. Again, they should have already applied
I was gonna
at
say,
that point. And then the pre-approval and everything with no unreasonable conditions by a certain date, that should not be more than a couple days out. Like your pre-approval, so you should almost already have as well.
What if it is that prequel that like some people are, like
Yeah.
get that weird prequel every now and then from lenders?
Yeah. Like, I mean, the pre-qual is honestly, that should be better. Street approvals, like, how much money do you make, how much money you spend,
Yeah.
great, here,
5 items.
good pre-approval here, like,
That one always just like,
yeah,
everyone puts something different there.
yeah.
But you think, like, straight up, it could be like, if they've got that pre-approval, you submit that with the offer, you're covered.
I think you're pretty good at I mean, you are though.
Okay, yeah,
I mean, it's,
Should we put about 10 day gap?
yeah, I do.
Just in case, I mean.
But it could be a few days, you're fine.
But you can't really, you can get an approval before you start looking, but you have to have you have to have a date in property in contract before you can actually apply for the loan.
You
Is
could,
that what that means?
you could get mostly through the application process. You should have already applied. Like you can start the application process without the property direct. Right. All right, next part. This is always interesting. I want to go to this. Final loan approval occurs when lender funds the loan. End of sentence. End of sentence. So if it is contingent on seller obtaining financing, final approval is when?
It's fun.
When it's funded.
And the money's there, and so everybody signed at the closing table.
That's
That's
right.
when they get funded.
Correct, when it's funded. So that's an important part. If buyer changes the lender during the financing period, they must notify the seller within 5 calendar days. Okay? So I've got Mutual of Omaha that I applied with. And then I changed to Guild. All right, I have to notify in 5 days. Can the seller say no?
Yeah.
So it doesn't change
The original closing date.
Question. Good point. I
No,
like the way you're thinking. Can the seller say no?
No,
No, they cannot, because right here it says lender may change. And when it does, if it does, you have to tell me. And now if you switch to lender I hate because of experience last year, it doesn't matter. What Kathy said is the next part, absent approval by the seller, buyer cannot change the lender if the closing date agreed upon in paragraph 4 will change as a direct result. Well, duh. Like, you can't change that. You can't change the closing date. You've agreed upon a closing date. So this one does get convoluted. We get like both of the things will happen is they'll come back and say, well, hey, I changed lenders. Well, you can't do that. Or, okay, that's great. We're not going to move forward. I can do that. But the other side will happen too. Says, well, it says I can change lenders. Yeah, but you now need to change the closing date. The seller doesn't need to do anything. Like you're welcome to change, but you can't change the closing date. The reason they put this in here is not for redundancy. I think it is for redundancy. It's more so as a reminder to the buyer, like, sure, go change. But understand if you change the closing date, I don't care if it's a better lender. I don't care what the reasoning is. You can't change the closing. Now, could the seller agree to change the closing date? Sure. Sure, everything can be renegotiated. As long as everyone agrees. All right, lender, here's who it is, type of loan, everything there. Due diligence. We have this for an hour and a half today. It was an hour. We'll get through due diligence and appraisal. Yeah, we'll get through this. It'll be a little bit longer, but we'll get through this. Due diligence, basically, here's what due diligence is. All this is spelled out in there. Due diligence means that until due diligence expires at 6 p.m. on that date, the buyer can cancel for any reason or what?
no reason.
No reason. Important statement to me. They can literally cancel for any reason or no reason at all. We have one right now. Where it's like, we operated in good faith. We said we would do repair. We were doing negotiations. We were doing all these. Doesn't matter. Does not matter. Now, during that time frame, there are a couple things that can happen. You can accept the property as is. Great. It's obvious. We go, we show the property, looks like it's in great shape, a couple things, I got a good deal, I'm not concerned about it. We can negotiate for repairs using Form 525 that you both have to agree upon. You do that, great. You sign 525, great. Due diligence is over. 525 specifically states, by signing this, due diligence is over. You agree on everything, move forward. Number 3, you can other remedies, the attorney drafted approved verbiage in Form 390, which could be along the lines of, we agree to give money. Right? Or whatever you decide to do. We agree to change the closing date. We agree to do this. We agree to do whatever. You can do that. We agree to no longer clean the property that you asked for earlier because we're doing this. There's a handful of different things that can be done outside of 525. Terminate by delivered notice of Form 313 and what's that word? Say it with me.
Termination.
And, say it with me. And, there we go. And means and, it's not or, and the termination fee to the seller's notice addressed by the due diligence deadline. Okay? So it does take both, which is why don't wait to the day of to terminate. Okay. Now, a couple things that come up in this. Failure to do these, this bullet down here on the bottom basically says failure to do all of these means the buyer's agreeing to move forward and as is condition. Okay, that's pretty simple. Couple things is happening right now. People are submitting forms 525 with expirations on them. Means nothing to this contract. Now, it can set a sense of urgency for the seller. To say, hey, Mr. Seller, I think due diligence doesn't end until April 15th, today's April 10th. I'm submitting this repair request. I have put an expiration for April 12th on it, simply because if you don't reply by then I might move on and do something else. I don't know yet. But by not responding to this happens all the time, is someone will submit a repair addendum and they'll have a deadline 3 days before due diligence, and the seller won't respond by then, and then they'll say, well, the seller's in breach. It's like the seller's not in breach. You can't pause for a deadline that's not mapped out in the contract. So my personal advice to you on this is when you're negotiating Form 525, do not put an expiration date. Because if you don't, nothing, blank.
Well, I always put the end of the due diligence period.
That's fine. I mean, you can do that. Because here's what happens. If you put an expiration date and then the seller signs it after said expiration date, you potentially have a voidable contract. Right. So again, nothing's a problem until it's a problem. Why would you put an expiration date on? Or it says create urgency. Okay, well, just create urgency then. Like there's no contractual obligation for them to respond. There's no contractual obligation for them to respond at all. Right? They've already done everything they need to do. You're asking for this and they may be saying, no, now, okay, don't die on this hill. Okay? If you receive as a listing agent, a Form 525 with an expiration date on it, don't make the first phone call be like, this is irrelevant. I want to all the time because I'm like, what are you doing? If it's unrealistic, I would say, hey, I see that you want us to respond to them. They're not going to be able to do that. Like, we're doing everything we can to get you a response, but we got to do research. We got to call a contractor. We got to do all these. So I want to make sure we're on the same page of where we are. Regardless of what their answer is, they have the right. It's due diligence, right? They can come back and be like, no, if you don't respond by Friday, they're going to walk. Well, go ahead and let them walk because we can't do it. You wouldn't say that. You go to your seller and say, here's what they've said. They want to answer by Friday. They're saying if we don't answer by Friday, they're going to go ahead and terminate, which is within their right in the contract.
Right. Yeah. So this, I don't know if this even makes sense, but let me ask you this. So if you, like you were talking about the discrepancy in the concessions.
Mm-hmm.
If you had like that 5,000 that was, go back to the seller if they can't accept it, could you use number 3 to get that if the seller agrees to it?
Well, the problem
Like if
is
you're gonna use the 5,000 for painting the house or.
I think if they can't get it, they can't get it. Okay. It's a good question though. Email me that question. Cause I want to know the answer to it. You'll email me that question.
See the question?
He's saying like, we talked about all these things that are closing costs, so they can't, they can't have all, probably what would.
Like to mitigate that.
Yeah.
You might not get it for a concession, but if they know that they were already gonna give you 20,000, you might not get 20,000 of concession.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put it into 3, you can still get that 5,000.
Don't think it's considered a concession at that point. I don't think you can separate it,
But can you do something totally
but. You could try to do something to say $5,000 to be held in escrow and paid to a contractor.
offset?
Maybe. I don't know. Shoot me that email. That's a idea. All right. Anything else on due diligence? By the way, notice address. We're asked for here. Notice address for the seller. This is why it asked for it. Seller, seller's agent, all these things. Notice address. Where sellers wants all contracts, correspondence, and termination fee to be sent. That's either going to be a physical address. You can put a Venmo in there if you would like to be clear, or something. If it's not in there, you need to understand as a buyer's agent, you could have a problem. If your buyer wants to terminate, you don't know where to bring it. And then all of a sudden you can't get a hold of the listing agent.
Or you could just say no termination fees and that make it all better.
You could.
And fine.
And see, I love your persistence on this.
It's getting.
I was gonna ask that by the agents here, most of you when you're writing, are you leaving those blank, or are you asking, either when you're writing for your buyer, are you asking your buyer to leave
I'll put
anything on?
Big
the-
fat zero.
Yeah.
Put a big fat zero.
There you go.
And that become like he says, don't die on that hill, but I always tell my clients. They could push back and say, hey, if we're gonna be off the market 10 days, then we want $300 termination fee. If that becomes an issue, are you okay with losing that $300 or whatever? So I always put zero, but if they push back, I'll go back to my
That's what I
buy.
was curious.
I didn't, and you know, who taught me that was, Greg. One of my.
Flanagan.
Yes.
Right, well, that's no longer here.
Flanagan was the one that said that, and I thought that's a great idea, because who cares? But there, as a seller, of course, you're gonna want compensation, like, I'm off the market, we're off the market 10 days, I want $10,000 for it.
That's classic.
Yeah.
Buyer's agent, 0. Listing agent, 10 grand.
Yeah.
Listen, conceptually, I don't disagree with it. Like, I mean,
In point of view, that's complete sense.
yeah, oh yeah, 100%. One could argue the same thing with earnest money. Well, yeah, I mean, Lynn's not in here. There is no agent in this town whose average earnest money per buyer is less than Lynn's. I don't know how she gets away with it. She'll sell $600,000 house and have like $500 in earnest money. How did you get them to agree to that?
When I first came to Greg was the guy that, and I'm like, well, I was buying my own house, it was a $380,000 house. He's like, okay, $1,000. I'm like, $1,000. I just walk away from $1,000 all day long and twice on Sundays.
And we'll also understand, careful what you're saying.
It's not, it's changed a little bit, by the way.
Oh, no, what I mean by that is when you breach a contract, you don't lose your earnings.
So I understand that.
And herein lies the problem. That's why I don't think they kind of agree with the whole, here's $1,000, $10,000. It's not a point,
Well,
right? Because the termination fee is different. Earnest money is not. Termination fee, I totally think, like, from a seller standpoint, do them, it costs me $3,000 a month to carry this house. If I, gonna be off the market for 15 days for due diligence, I want $1,500,
well,
right? Whatever.
I limit the due diligence. I mean, I don't like.
Correct. But honestly, I think that's from a negotiation standpoint, as the buyer side, that's more important. Because if a buyer's going to lose their earnest money.
Yeah.
It's because they were in breach. The earnest money could potentially be the absolute least of their concerns.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but if you have $16,000, like you said, you can think twice, you need to have skin in the game.
Yeah.
$1,000 is not even like,
Yeah.
and it shouldn't be. Some
Yeah.
people don't even have that. So I guess it should come.
All right, we'll do inspection rights and then one more paragraph and we'll get out of here. So inspection rights, basically, they have the right to inspect. This one's gotten fun. This one's gotten tricky. This one's gotten tricky. First sentence, buyer in South Carolina licensed and insured inspectors. Reasonably perform any reasonably ultimately non-destructive examination, make reasonable record of the property with reasonable notice to seller. Through closing, through closing. You can have inspections through closing. When? Through.
Through.
Once due diligence is over, can you have inspections?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Listing Agent. No, you can't.
Push back on that.
Yes, you can. Now, can the buyer
Get out.
of it or ask for anything after due diligence?
Yeah.
No. They cannot. So here's what's come up recently. We had a seller who was, there was a lot of trust that happened very early on in the transaction. So let's say that's there. But the argument became, well, they want so-and-so to come look at the house because they still think there's an issue, but so-and-so is not a South Carolina licensed inspector. There's a strong argument that they can't do it. Now, use your bandwidth wisely. If you're already out of due diligence, who cares? Let them inspect it. Let Uncle Frank can take a look at it. Uncle Frank can tell them whatever they want. They can't get out of the contract.
Well, I still have a problem with it.
I get it.
Let it go. No, it's not enough.
I mean, I know where they.
And if it was Uncle Frank and said, yeah, you got black mold,
Yeah.
and they said, that's it, we're walking,
Yeah,
then you mitigate for earnest money.
Right.
Was there a breach?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm nervous about parents coming and looking because, you know, feel like.
Yeah, listen, I get it. I get it.
I mean, that's where you show up at the inspection, the Chrome, talking to the parents.
Yeah, listen, I get it, but at the end of the day, put yourself in the buyer's shoes. No, I don't want you looking at the property.
Oh, no, I mean, I do, but the parents have put more than one kiss of death on.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's their job.
You know, diligence definitely has to be over before it, I mean, I just had that. I'm sure parents can go on, go ahead. But
Nancy's negotiation.
Bring your parents, just
Stay on until after April 15th.
everyone's, all agents are kind of like, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it.
All right, so that's really kind of it with that one. Appraised value is what it is. Wood infestation report. We've covered most of these. We're a little bit over. One thing I do want to point out, section 24. This is the not my job.
stay in your lanes.
It's a better way.
Thank you.
Stay in your lane paragraph. I like that. I'm gonna switch. Good job. I'll give you credit. This is stay in your lane paragraph. I think it's very important you explain this to the buyers and the sellers for the reason that you can invite people in for support, not because you're wanting to avoid to do your job. So don't misunderstand me on this. But what this is saying, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, is that I'm going to give you no warranties or representations on these things. And I'm gonna read through because I want you to know all of the things that may come up in your mind. Condition of the property, including but not limited to all of these things, which is why we encourage you to hire an inspector. The inspector is the one that's going to guide you on this. Number two, conditions of the property, the survey or legal matters and square footage. If anything on that is important to you, I highly encourage that we see if the seller has a survey or we have a survey done. Okay, number three, so off-site conditions, anything around it, if you have questions about, here are your resources to go to it. Schools, here's your best resource for schools. Title, including but not limited to easements, encroachments, protections, encumbrances, restrictions, covenants, setbacks, and all of these. We are going to have an attorney that we will engage once we go under contract. The attorneys will handle this for you and they will relay it to you. Zoning ordinances, if you have any questions about the zoning in or around the property, let me know and I will connect you with the right person to get that. Projected income, value, marketability, taxes, insurance, and all of these things. If any of these are important to you, let me know. I will connect you with the right person for it. Okay, there are a lot. This is, again, I know it sounds like it's like the sky's falling. We're in a litigious society. And we have E&O, which is money. So we are often brought in because of that. And so the more we can do to mitigate this up front, to make sure people understand who's in charge of what, the better. Now, I'm not talking to this to absolve you of responsibility. I'm here to tell you this to protect your client. Because all of these situations, I mean, we've seen there's been 3 cases in the last 6 months that I've been involved in the letter, where at the end of the day, it sucks because where the client ended up is terrible. Like nobody wanted that for the client. The problem is we're fighting the wrong people to make the clients whole. And it's always coming back to the agents. And a lot of times, no offense, I love agents. We put ourselves in the position where the client didn't know where else to go because they thought we were the expert in all of that. So when that was the problem, we were the first ones to get the blame. So when I say the stay in your lane paragraph, thank you, Nancy, that's what I mean by it. And I think it's important to have that conversation. That's the script to have with your client right there. I just want you to know these are all things that may come up. There's gonna be a lot on at you. The obvious one is number one, where are you gonna do that? Are any of these others concerned for you? Well, yeah, the survey. Okay, great. Tell me more about that. Well, we want to put a fence in. Okay, well, if that is an issue that you want to make sure that you have taken care of before you go in, then let's get a survey. And here's what the process is to do that. By the way, when I say inspector, the inspector is going to come to the house and they're going to inspect the house. I recommend so-and-so, right? So-and-so will probably be fine with you being there for the end, when the end of the inspection. I suggest that you be there so you can understand directly from the inspector. This is where we see a lot of, right? Inspector comes, tells me, the agent, and then I go tell the buyer, don't do that. Don't do that. Okay? All right.
I always tell them, read the report, read it. call the inspector.
Yeah.
I was there for that,
Yeah.
although you couldn't be, but you call him directly, get it from the horse's mouth, because I'm not a radon mole.
Well, and here's the deal, and people, I haven't think about how on this with an agent about 5 years ago. I went to go to meet a buyer in an attic in June. And why these things can't happen in the wintertime.
Right.
And he was like, should have been done this way, this should have been an issue, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, why are we talking about this? Why aren't you talking to the inspector? He's like, I never knew I had any ability to talk to the inspector because the agent was the one who was telling me these things here. And I was like, well, okay. And he was like, they should have put me in touch with the inspector. And the aha from that, where it seems obvious, when I went and talked to the agent, I said, here's what you do. And the agent was like, I was doing that because I thought it was helping the client. I was just trying to relay the information. I was like, had you just turned them over to the inspector, you thought they were going to think you weren't doing your job. But they would have preferred. Right. All right. I know we didn't get all the way through it. I know we skipped around here towards the end, but it has been an hour and 12 minutes, which is a very long time. If you're listening to me. I'm happy to hang out if you have any other questions or things you want to go through. Oh, actually, one last thing, because I didn't just see this. Checking this off here.
That's all.
Yes. And including it
Necessity.
is a necessity. Because if that's checked off there, and they sign this one, not sign Form 120, you do not have a ratified contract. Because you're missing the material fact to the contract. This is coming up quite a bit right now. We've got one right now where they said, hey, the listing agent, said that they were offering 2%. We submitted the compensation agreement at 2.5%. Because again, listing agent can tell you that you can always ask for more. So negotiation is. They signed off on the final. Now we're a couple days after, and we said, hey, we need you to sign this, and say, well, we're not signing that. We already told you we agreed to 2%. Buyers agents like, that's great, we don't have a contract. Like, no, we signed a contract. You signed the contract, you didn't sign a compensation agreement, which is reference to
Part of the contract.
part of the contract, right? It's fun. All right, guys, thanks, appreciate you being here.
My only other question, thought of these, I think Sarah, you brought it up.
Yeah,
So it is initial. Another question.
On the.
Say
yeah.
we did like an appraisal